Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude, the Middle East between conflict and negotiations. And with us, we have as our guest Faridi Farhi. She's Affiliate Professor of Political Science at the University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. Thank you for coming. And as a start, you had visited Iran recently in the fall. And so would you just give us some impressions about the politics, society, and so forth, and we begin from there.
First of all, let me begin by saying that I hadn't been there for 7 years because things had turned ugly in Iran for a good period of time. But in June of this year, there was an election. And the election unexpectedly turned the country towards the middle of the spectrum, as opposed to being hardline. So a new president was elected. He was not expected to be elected, but he was elected on a platform that essentially called for improved relations with the outside world, resolution of the nuclear issue on Iran, but most importantly, from the point of view of a good part of the population, improved economy, as well as desecuritization of the Iran's political environment. Because since the 2009 contested election, what had happened in Iran was a series of repressive policies, a lot of arrest, a lot of closure of the political system. So the election itself and the decision on the part of the population that had become sort of disenchanted with the electoral process since the 2009 election to actually participate in the election. Close to 73% of the electorate participated in the election and made possible the election of Hassan Rouhani as the president. So by the time I got there, the environment in Iran, the political environment, was very much changed since it had been the last time I was in Iran. And in fact, that was the reason I was able to go back. And you could make an argument that the population was quite happy with its choice. The country was calmer. And as I was there, the new government, I guess, made true to its promise, which was to try to resolve the nuclear issue, the conflict that Iran has had with Western countries over its nuclear program. And in November, there was an interim agreement between the so-called P5+1, which is the 5 permanent members of the United Nations, plus Germany and Iran. All the foreign ministers of P5+1 were there, as well as the new foreign minister of Iran, and they reached an interim agreement that, in fact, just began to be implemented at the end of January. And that was received very well by the population because Iran has faced one of the most ferocious sanctions regime ever implemented against any country in the history of the world. Its central bank is sanctioned. So even if Iranians can sell some of their oil, for example, what the difficulty they have is to get their money back because no bank in the world is allowed, based on resolutions passed by United States Congress, legislation passed, to give them money. Because if they do, then they will become sanctions by American Treasury Department. So this deal that effectively puts a cap, temporary cap on Iran's enrichment activities, uranium enrichment activities, in exchange for release of some of Iran's own money, nevertheless was perceived as an important move on the part of new government, and has underwritten an opening of the political system. Not that repression or the kind of other activities that Iranian judiciary or other branches of the government are engaged in have disappeared. But certainly the environment is quite different than it was before.
That shows you the power of the United States in terms of imposing sanctions through the United States, not through the United Nations.
Absolutely. There are two sets of sanctions that are imposed on Iran. There are UN resolutions that have passed that effectively impose sanctions on Iran's nuclear program. Because of Iran's nuclear program, and they're actually quite limited. They are limited in terms of, for example, shipments of arms to Iran and so on. But what are called extraterritorial sanctions or unilateral sanctions on the part of the United States not only imposes sanctions on American companies doing investment in Iran or doing trade, but it also requires other countries to abide by certain rules, including, if they invest in Iran, they become sanctioned. As I said, if they trade with Iran, if they trade money with Iran, the banks, Iran was effectively this whole global SWIFT system, which, the system that gives a number to banks, a variety of countries, was effectively shut down against the Iranians. So really, on top of the fact that countries like Japan, China, and so on, that do trade oil with Iran have been required to significantly reduce their purchases of oil from Iran. So Iran's oil exports have dropped dramatically. But nevertheless, they still export close to 1 million barrels a day. But the problem is that they cannot get the money that they get from selling that oil back into the country.
Maybe in kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, so they do, but and remember, for example, with a country like Iran exports quite a bit of oil, for example, to India. Okay, and it has a highly positive trade balance of trade with India. Iran does not need many things from India. It buys a lot of rice these days through a barter system, but that doesn't, resolve the major inequality that exists in terms of that balance. So it works, for example, it may work with a country like China, where Iran, ends up buying a lot of low-quality goods from China. That's also a problem. But ultimately, it's not a good situation for Iran. And it has led to a situation, the sanctions regime has led to a situation where Iranian economy shrank by almost 6% last year, which is, a very, very significant drop in production and productivity. And some of it has to do, as Iranians claim, with the mismanagement of the economy that occurred under the previous government, the government of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So mismanagement had something to do with it, but quite a bit of it had to do with this very, very tight noose, ever-tightening noose against the Iranian economy.
But is like those sanctions by the United States, unilateral ones, are they sanctioned, no pun intended, by international law?
Well, international law is essentially it's a force of law. You could make it. It's essentially, United States essentially goes and tells, Chinese companies, European companies, that if you do business with Iran, what's going to happen is that our American laws will punish you, and you will not be able to do business in the United States. Now, we are talking about, trillions of dollars economy, and that is United States, and an economy that is barely $1 trillion Iranian economy. So in that kind of dynamic, you actually, people, companies make choices because they have to pay fines. But it is also important to understand that it's not the European Union also very much cooperated with this process. The final I guess, straw that broke the Iranians' economy's back was this sanctioning of the Iranian central bank, which is very much implemented by the European unions in cooperation with the
So how
United
long
States.
ago was that, the central bank?
That was in July of 2012.
Okay, so it's recent. It's not like from 30, 35 years
No,
ago.
no, no,
Yeah,
no, no,
you
no,
see,
no.
yeah, okay.
Now, United States has imposed a variety of sanctions on Iran since 1990. I mean, since the beginning of the revolution.
79, 80,
Okay,
yeah.
but in 1990s, during the Clinton administration, this idea of extraterritoriality, that is to say, to try to punish other companies who invest in Iran's oil and gas sector, that idea came into being during the Clinton administration, when there was really no discussion of Iran's nuclear program. And that was directed towards investment in the oil and gas sector. But for a period of time, oil companies, European oil companies, ignored those laws. It was bundled with sanctions of Libya. It was called Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, ILSA it was called. So for example, a French company like Total did have a major deal with Iran. And the American administrations made a decision to look the other way. With the new dynamics under the Obama administration, all those things got bundled up with the concerns over the nuclear program and the ability of Obama administration to bring everybody, including the Russians, to sanction Iran. And then all those old trade and investment sanctions also came to be implemented with much more ferocity than it was before.
Yeah, so it has been gradual, but picking up steam as we
Absolutely,
went
it was.
along,
I mean, part of the reason it has picked up was because of the goodwill the Obama administration brought into office as an administration that was not a warmongering administration like the Bush administration. And the way he managed to bring everybody together, including, as I suggested, the Chinese and the Russians, as well as the Europeans, was by making the argument that sanctions are an alternative to war. Okay, so the Europeans and others essentially made an argument, agreed that, you know, we're going to sanction in order to prevent war similar to Iraq. The problem with that argument was that this noose became so tightened, it went for the jugular of the Iranian economy, that if you didn't do anything about it, if you didn't start some sort of negotiations, the sanction regime would end up in war, because you keep churning it, and then there is nothing more left, and the Iranians are still not giving in, not crying uncle. So the ultimate, you know, the next step would ultimately be war. That became an incentive for the Obama administration under a new Secretary of State, John Kerry, seeing also that something fundamental had happened in Iran, a change through the election, and a new administration that was interested in some sort of negotiation in Iran. That created the context for this new interim agreement. But this is an interim agreement.
6 months, right?
6 months that can be delayed or extended for another 6 months, but the positions are still vastly apart.
Right.
And there is tremendous amount of pressure on the Obama administration to take a maximalist position and still insist that Iran should dismantle it's what the Iranians consider to be their peaceful nuclear program. And of course, that kind of demand has not worked, for a decade, and it will not work. Yeah. So unless there is some flexibility on the part of the United States, and of course some flexibility on the part of Iran, because the positions are so different, there is no guarantee that a final agreement will be reached.
Okay, so you mentioned there's pressure on the Obama administration probably to go to war with Iran and so forth. So where does this come from?
From the region, and then as well as the influences regional players have on American politics. So obviously the Israelis are very unhappy. They want Obama to take a maximalist position and not allow what Prime Minister Netanyahu calls Iranian capability to build a bomb. The issue is not whether the Iranians have a bomb or not, or whether to prevent them. They should not have a capability to build a bomb. The pressure also comes from the Saudis, who have been freaked out in the Middle East since the American invasion of Iraq, and what they consider to be the American misbegotten decision to turn Iraq away from its traditional Arab allies, the Saudis and so on, and make Iraq closer, or from their point of view, under the influence of the Iranian regime. So they consider an agreement with Iran essentially creating a situation where Iran will become a much more powerful player in the region, being able to implement what the Saudis consider to be Iranian hegemonic aspirations. The reality is that there is a geostrategic game going on, and the Saudis want the United States to remain an enemy of Iran, through that process contain Iran for them. So there is the Saudi component, and then there is the Israeli component, and of course the Israelis have tremendous influence inside American politics. So one of the other problems that exist is that the interim agreement essentially says that by the time you get a final agreement, the Iranians would limit their nuclear program, as well as allow extra transparency. That means more intrusive inspections of their nuclear program in all its components. In return, the interim agreement says that the Americans will lift sanctions. Okay? Now, Mr. Obama has tremendous leeway in lifting executive sanctions. Okay? Or, he can maybe not implement some of them, but ultimately, in order to lift sanctions, he has to go to United States Congress and ask them to lift the sanctions. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. The sanctions that have been passed by United States Congress usually were passed 99-0 or 100-0, essentially suggesting to you the influence the Israeli government has had in United States Congress, and the reality that a core group of congressional senators, as well as Congress people, have made clear that their position on Iran's nuclear program is that they want a dismantling of Iran's nuclear program. And that's just not a realistic option in relationship to Iran. The Bush administration tried for 8 years to go zero enrichment, and the Iranians just said no. At that time, the Iranians were willing to limit their centrifuges to less than 3,000. They could have reached an agreement on with limitations as well as intrusive inspections. They weren't willing to negotiate. Now Iran has 19,000 centrifuges, and still going. So this pattern has not worked, and Obama seems to understand that. At the same time, the pressures are there, And because of that, it's not at all clear whether it's possible or not.
How realistic in terms of achieving U.S. goals if the extremists in the United States won the debate to go to war with Iran? How realistic would be the success of U.S. interests in that region if they go to war with Iran?
I mean, look at the Middle East at this particular moment. I mean, just look at the Middle East. Unless we assume that the interest of United States is creating instability, that is the objective of United States. You know, and some people do make that argument that, that's United States interest in the region. I do not agree with that argument. But look at the Middle East at this particular moment. And Iraq is in the midst of a mini civil war. Syria is in the midst of a full-fledged civil war. Egypt is a mess. Lebanon may be on the brink. There are not that many. Turkey has serious domestic issues, political issues. If you look at the map of the Middle East, Iran seems to be the only country in the Middle East that is relatively stable. Okay, its electricity is working. People have clean water. You know, some basic stuff. You know, so the whole thought of United States again trying to first bomb a country into, economic backwardness, okay, and which necessarily also creates instability. I don't see under any circumstances for that to be a good situation in Iran, particularly as the United States is about to be leaving Afghanistan, sort of exposing the forces that is leaving in Afghanistan to, possibility of attacks and so on. I mean, the Iranians are not going to just sit down if they are attacked. They have, they have their elements in Iraq, they have their elements in, they have some sort of deterrent capabilities too. So I do not see any justifiable reason to attack Iran, thinking that things are going to get better. The argument is that the attack is going to be limited.
There's no such thing.
And it's going to be only its nuclear facilities. The problem is that, Iranian nuclear program is not like, one nuclear plant like it was in Osirak in Iraq, when the Israelis attacked it in 1980s. You have an industry in Iran. Iran is the only country in the Middle East that has a working nuclear plant at this point. Are you going to attack that? Obviously you cannot, because that's, that's right sitting on top of the Persian Gulf. I mean, it's a major, ecological disaster. And Iran's enrichment program, variety of, different stages of its program is all over Iran. So, and in any case, as Obama himself has acknowledged, you're dealing with a country that effectively has the knowledge to reconstitute this program if it wants to. Okay. So what is the use of it?
Yeah. So we can then, let's say, deduce that it's not in the interest of the United States to go to war with Iran because it's going to be a big mess, whether it's ecological and disastrous for the peoples there.
And instability.
And instability. And then you don't know what the implications of this would be on the United States in terms of economic, the economy and the global economy for that matter. Because again, as you said, the Iranians are not going to sit down and take it just like sitting down. And it could be a regional war, regardless whether the United States can win, quote unquote, that war or not. The fact of the matter, it will be a mess globally.
Absolutely.
And then there's the problem of Russia and China. I mean, are they going to sit there and just look at the United States doing this? I mean, that's a big problem. And then you have Israel, too. I mean, in any kind of retaliation, against an American attack, Israel might be game for the Iranians, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so that is a major problem. Yesterday, the Iranians had celebrated the 35th anniversary of their revolution. And Hassan Rouhani, the president, he gave a speech. So could you tell us something about what was said in that speech in terms of like, where are we now after so many negotiations on the 5+1 nuclear file of Iran? Where are we now given the Rouhani speech yesterday?
Same situation as we were before. That is to say, he essentially said that Iran is serious in trying to improve relationship with Western countries. Iran is serious in trying to resolve the issue, the nuclear issue. But he also said, you cannot bully us. You also have to be serious in terms of trying to reach a compromise on this issue. So it's the same dynamics. Iran, the negotiations and the implementation of the negotiations is actually going very well. Okay, that is to say, Iran is pursuing a two-track approach. There is a track with P5+1 that has led to, as I suggested, a cap on Iran's enrichment capabilities. United States has released some of Iranian funds, but then there is also another track, which is Iran negotiating with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And on that one, too, there has been an agreement for the agency to be able to see more sites and so on. So the negotiations are actually going pretty well, or at least the agreement is going pretty well. At the end of this month, negotiations for the final agreement will begin. What is problematic at this moment in terms of the dynamics of the negotiations is that because the Obama administration is under so much pressure not to be appeased by Iran, and as I suggested, to go for a dismantling of Iran's nuclear program. The Obama administration, Obama himself, as well as Secretary Kerry, have been constantly being forced in congressional testimonies or in public discussions to talk very tough, talk about dismantling Iran's program. Obama today, a few days ago, again talked about not ignoring other options on the table. Americans constantly talk about, in relationship to Iran, all options are on the table, which essentially means that there is a military option. And that really pisses the Iranians off. So in the 35th anniversary, yesterday, which is more like a carnival every year, there were all sorts of posters making fun of, this idea of options on the table. There were tables, with Mickey Mouse on them. What are the options on the table? And effectively, a reaction from the hardliners in Iran saying, we are ready for any option for us. So this kind of language in the United States is feeding, the hardline language inside Iran. Iran is also a contested political environment. And of course, the hardliners from the beginning have opposed this agreement, even the interim agreement, saying that the United States cannot be trusted because they are not going to keep their end of the bargain. And of course, when Obama talks about dismantling and so on, they effectively come and say, we told you so. They are not going to be able, and that strengthens them. So this new government that is in Iran has to also play it, very carefully, because it is also under pressure. In Iran, you also have hardliners who find their existence in opposition to the United States. So they're also very much opposed to the agreement.
Yeah. Well, there's another thing. The Americans seem to want to discuss with Iran not only the nuclear issue, but also other issues in the Middle East. For instance, their relationship with Syria,
Absolutely.
their relationship in terms of Lebanon and other places, Hezbollah, and also the Gulf area. So the Iranians, it seems to me, they are saying, no, we'll do the nuclear issue, and then maybe we'll deal with other things.
No, actually, what happened was actually very interesting, and it sort of gives you a hint of how incoherent American foreign policy has become, essentially because of domestic dynamics and pressures. As you know, a process has been set up to negotiate, presumably, or to find a diplomatic or political solution for the problem of Syria, for the civil war in Syria. That process is initiated, essentially is guided by United Nations. There is, a representative, a UN representative, Mr. Ibrahim, your namesake almost, who is heading that process. Now, the first meeting was held a few weeks ago, and the Iranians had said that we would be happy to be part of that process and be helpful. And in fact, Secretary General of United Nations extended an invitation to the Iranians, which the Iranians accepted. But immediately he had to withdraw the invitation, essentially because the United States pressured the United Nations to withdraw, making the argument that in order for the Iranians to participate in this process, they have to accept the premises of Geneva I, or the first meeting that occurred with Russia, with the Syrians not involved, that essentially calls for Assad's removal, President Bashar Assad's removal. The Iranians had said, we will participate without any preconditions. We did not participate in Geneva I, so on what basis should we accept its premises? But if you want us to come and influence and participate in this process, we'll be happy to do so. Now, the Americans said, because the Iranians had not come publicly and said that Assad must go, they cannot participate. Ban Ki-moon said that he had received private assurances, and he was happy with that, but the Americans were not. Now, what was fascinating about all these things is that just a week later after this, after Americans made this big public spectacle about Iranians should not participate and effectively prevented them, Secretary Kerry and Iran Foreign Minister Javad Zarif meet in Munich for the security conference in Munich, and they have a 1-hour private conversation. And in that private conversation, Mr. Kerry asks Iran's foreign minister to help in Syria. And Iran's foreign minister says, I have no authority to talk Syria with you because, because of the spectacle. Effectively, Mr. Kerry, I wrote a piece, wants the cake and eat it too, wants to condemn Iranians for not accepting the premises, but yet privately wants the Iranians to help in Syria in convincing Assad to transition himself out. And that was a dynamic that the Iranians were not willing to accept.
To be specific about Geneva I, which was between Obama and Putin, it calls for a transitional government or transitional regime in Syria, and not directly like the removal of Assad, but the Americans would translate it as, or interpret it as, that means the removal of Assad, where the Russians say no.
Absolutely.
So
but that's the dilemma the Americans are caught.
Right.
Because Mr. Obama came from the beginning and said Assad must go.
Yeah.
Okay? And
read my lips.
Read my lips. And the problem in that dynamic is that first of all, Assad doesn't want to go. Okay.
And he's winning on the ground.
And he's winning on the ground. And of course, the civil war in Syria has gone out of control. So there are a lot of elements involved that are not necessarily, quote unquote, on the side of United States. They are radical Islamists that are actually fighting not only among themselves, but also forces that are Syrians who are opposed to Assad's regime. So they have come from outside. They are funded by others. So it's become a mess. So if you're going to have negotiations with a government that is present, okay, Assad's regime is present, you cannot begin those negotiations by making an argument. Assad must go. Of course, he's not going to play. And there is no reason, as I suggested, from the point of view of the Iranians, for the Iranians to play this game unless they get something out of it, okay? For the Iranians, who have been, the country has been contained, has been isolated, has been called a rogue state. So calling them to come and sit in a regional negotiation table is effectively acknowledging the legitimacy of the Islamic regime, okay? So that's something for the Iranians, very important for them, because they say, see, we are a big enough regional player that you cannot ignore us, you cannot isolate us, you ultimately need us to run the region, okay? So we need to be on the table. But the Americans say, no, you come to the table according to our terms, and if you don't, then please do something for us privately. It's not going to work.
That's what happened with the Syrians. They told the Syrians, the Americans, the Brits, and the French, and maybe others, told the Syrians, through their intelligence, operatives, that why don't you cooperate with us for Al-Qaeda, So the Syrians said, well, you want cooperation against terrorism, etc. Okay, we got to do it like in a formal way and not like behind the scenes, And so like, why don't you go home, and when you make sure like you want to do it, we're happy to do that, fighting terrorism globally, etc. And that's actually the question of Geneva too. The Syrian position was, the main thing is to fight terrorism, because if terrorism is taking over, then the whole world, and not only Syria, is at risk. Not at risk, I mean, they destroying the country in Syria.
Of course, but that's, I mean, that's Assad's game too.
Yeah, of course.
That's Assad's game. I mean, in fact, from the beginning, some have even argued that he has promoted some of these to make the case that the Syrian civil war is about a government fighting against terrorism. So he is also playing a double game.
And no, I agree with you. But
in the process, the Syrians, the people of Syria are suffering.
I agree with you on that, but it's kind of far-fetched for me that he would like promote some Qaeda people to fight against Qaeda. It's like, he's promoting, he's fighting against himself.
But let's remember that he did a little bit of that in relationship to Iraq. The Syrian border was very much an important border in the kind of...
That was to fight the Americans,
but also the Shiite government in Iraq. So it was a very complicated game that the Syrians were playing.
No, that's true. They helped, the opposition or the resistance against the United States occupation of Iraq. That's true. Anyway, so that's, in terms of Geneva II, the first day of Geneva II, I think, was 22 January or something like that. And then right away after Kerry gave a speech in Geneva too, which was in some other place in Switzerland, Montreux, it was in Montreux, he went to Davos, to Davos for the economic forum, economic forum. And there he met Mr. Hassan Rouhani, right? And it is said that actually what was happening there at Davos between Rouhani and the Americans, or between the Iranians and the Americans, was much more important than what was going on in terms of Geneva II negotiations at Montreux the first day or the second. So Any?
No, as I said, the Iranian, I mean, it is possible that, some have argued that, when actually after the big meeting was between, as I suggested, it was between Kerry and Zarif in Munich, right after Davos. And people have argued that part of the reason a humanitarian corridor was open to the city of Homs was because of the Iranian help. I have no way of I have no way of knowing it. But in relationship to Syria, my understanding is that the Iranians are not playing, and it's not because as reported, the foreign ministry does not have an authority to play, because you have the Revolutionary Guards that runs the Syria game. No. It's because Iranian political system, these decisions are made by the National Security Council that includes the foreign minister as well as military chiefs, and they didn't want to play because they were not treated right.
Right, yeah, and that's what they said also. Yes. Like, you have to respect us. If you want to deal with us, you have to respect us.
Yeah, and in fact, Zarif, Foreign Minister Zarif reacted and actually said, it's not because I don't have authority to talk, it's just I don't want to talk. Under these circumstances, the kind of preconditions. And that's the dilemma that I'm trying to suggest the United States is engaged in. You're constantly coming face to face with this reality that the policies that you have pursued for a whole decade has not worked and is not working. So there is this realization that you need to change something. But yet at the same time, you cannot go this major step. It's actually a major step. This was last step to actually treat countries like Iran in ways that would acknowledge the kind of power that they have in the region. I mean, what kind of a country do you treat this way? You constantly tell them, and your own audience that, all options are on the table. That is, I mean, that's effectively, if you're talking about international law, is against United States Charter. You are constantly threatening, another country without that country posing any kind of threat to your territory and so on. But it's become so naturalized in our language, that the language itself is not treated as something odd.
Yeah, it's like, on a minor level, if somebody says to you, I want to kill you, that's terroristic threatening already, yeah? So that's, to me, is terroristic threatening, of a country, as you said,
it's not it's not a poker game. Your side
sanctions
here, military attack here, I mean, that's the language that is
even though the Iranians, some Iranian ships are in the Atlantic, right? So this is a joke.
No, I mean, the disparity of power has to be acknowledged. United States is a very, very powerful state in in the world.
Yeah, and it's using its bully power to do that. I mean, it's clear,
that needs to be acknowledged. But then, that's why I'm saying the confusion and the complexity comes when you have a superpower, a big power caught in dynamics that it cannot control. Therefore, it needs the help of regional players. And, if you need somebody's help, or if you want to engage with somebody else, you need to do it in a way that acknowledges the legitimacy of that country being engaged in a conversation or negotiation. You cannot constantly denigrate them all the time, Now, the Iranians do it in a different way, They go constantly in the streets and say, death to America,
Yeah, but...
of course, when you ask them, they say, we are not really talking about American people. When we say death to America, it's, death to American policies. It's our objection to American policy. And whenever I point out that may not be fully understood on the other side, they look at me, in awe. So they have their own problems over there as well in terms of their own politics. But in terms of the geopolitical game that is going on right now in the region, you have a United States that actually will be much better off if it begins cooperating with Iran, both in terms of the interest they have in Iraq as well as Afghanistan.
It'll be interesting to see that, see whether that's gonna, come to pass or not, because here you have like the counterweight, which is Zionist Israeli influence in the United States, right?
As well as the Saudi.
And Saudi. But I mean, compared to Zionist influence, the Saudi doesn't have AIPAC, for instance, and doesn't control basically the entire Congress in both its chambers.
Yeah, but they have had enough influence to convince Mr. Obama to go to Saudi Arabia in March again to sort of tell them, don't freak out, don't be upset, we are not going to abandon you, the relationship with Iran. So that and the Saudis are playing a very destructive role in the region. The funding of,
terrorists in Syria. The Qaeda in Syria is in the north and the south and towards the east, part of the east, towards the Iraqi border. I mean, they are in control and they move like cross borders.
Absolutely. So they are playing a very destructive role in Iraq. They are playing a very destructive role in Syria. They're playing a very destructive role in Lebanon.
In Lebanon, I mean, there are at least 10,000 Qaeda people in Syria, in Lebanon. I mean, so one could ask, like, could the Saudi Arabians have financed all of this and without a green light from anyone to produce all this number of terrorist fighters to go to Syria? I mean, the numbers are incredible. I mean, you can, some people say 200 or 1,000 or whatever, but even if it were 10,000 only in Syria, that's a lot of people, But actually, it's probably over 70,000. But anyway, be that as it may, the fact of the matter, someone had financed them and they gave them quarters and sent them through the borders from Jordan and from Turkey and from Lebanon. I mean, we know like these kind of cross-border things happening from Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. Hopefully now the Turks are, trying to change their policy. But here you have the United States trying to counter that Turkish awakening out of a dream, to try and mend fences with the Syrians through the Iranians, perhaps, as you mentioned before we got on the program. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But before that, maybe I want to ask about something that we have taken as an assumption and went with, which is the Iranian nuclear program. What's the issue? To me, it's not like assumed like they are doing wrong and we're trying to make it right. What's the issue?
The issue is that Iran has chosen to develop a program that includes most elements of the fuel cycle. So that Iran does legally. That is to say, because Iran has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it has the right to do all these things, because all of these elements are part of what or can be considered peaceful nuclear program. The problem is that when these elements are put together, that gives the Iranians the capability to build a nuclear bomb. And that freaks everybody out. Okay. Now, the Iranians, on the other hand, say that because they have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they cannot be treated differently than any other signatory of NPT. For example, the Brazilians, have a much more advanced nuclear program okay, in terms of their enrichment than the Iranians, but nobody is complaining. They do have the capability, okay? And some say that the Brazilians have, in the past, thought about the possibility of going nuclear, weaponizing. Certainly the Argentinians have. That's the issue. That's the issue. I think beyond that, okay, beyond that issue of the nuclear issue, because the Iranians have gone that route, and it has become, quote unquote, a national issue, an issue of resistance towards the bullying of outside powers. Ultimately, if the Iranians are able to reach an agreement with the United States in such a way that acknowledges the Iranian rights to enrich uranium inside Iran, or effectively allows for enrichment.
Up to a certain level.
Up to a certain level, doesn't matter. But it allows this program, which is now quite large. It's almost industrial scale, you know, 5,000 people, 15,000 people, 16,000 people work in this industry. Okay, it's not, you know, a bomb in the basement. Okay, it's a vast program that includes a nuclear plant, includes enrichment, it includes conversion. It may eventually include a heavy water plant and so on. Some sort of agreement with the United States, in effect not giving in to American bullying, despite, as I said, this ferocious sanctions regime. People are fearful it not only legitimizes the Islamic regime, and through legitimization, it makes it permanent, but it also, the agreement itself makes Iran the most powerful country in the region. That's where the opposition comes in Saudi.
Because then, like, the Israelis wouldn't be the most powerful at that time.
No, I mean, Israel...
Or the Saudis, or,
It's, you know...
So you have one extra regional power that is more powerful than the others.
No. Not only it's an extra regional power, it's an independent. Iran has an independent.
Exactly.
Okay, that's different. See, it's different. What is threatening about Iran is that Iran is really the most isolated country in the world, in the sense that its foreign policy is not a part of this camp or that camp. It really is operating as though it is, quote unquote, a legitimate country with, you know, a history that makes that foreign policy
it's
legitimate.
Basically the only independent regional power now, and with more, with nuclearization, I mean, not weaponization, but nuclear...
Just the capability,
technology,
yes.
Then it becomes much more so powerful.
Absolutely.
As opposed to, like, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc., who have not as much...
No, they have security relationship with other, with one or another.
With the United States,
Exactly.
NATO, Turkey is NATO, etc.
Exactly. And, so the argument on the part of Saudis or the Gulf states, Persian Gulf states, the smaller ones, is that this creates a condition that effectively lets loose Iran's hegemonic aspirations. I mean, if you look at the map of the Middle East, Iran sits right in the middle of the Middle East. It's large. It's a huge country population-wise. It's an educated country. So effectively, all the countries that are surrounding it in the Persian Gulf region, because that's the area that Iran has identified as its most immediate strategic concern. Iran is the biggest player, and that threatens the smaller countries, despite the fact that these smaller countries have been armed to the teeth by the United States. Saudi Arabia's military spending is 10% of its GNP. Oman spends that much, So they have security arrangements with all these American, naval bases in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Qatar, So this argument doesn't really make sense, given the protection these smaller states have from United States. But nevertheless, I think Iran's independence, independent foreign policy, as well as, its history of being an important player in the region when it had its act together. Iran has been a country that has gone through many ups and downs. It has disintegrated and brought back together. But nevertheless, it has a long history of being influential in that region.
And it's an Islamic republic.
Exactly. But so is Saudi Arabia, is an Islamic monarchy.
Yeah, but different.
It's a Wahhabi. It's a Wahhabi.
It's like a context for breeding Qaeda people. The Wahhabi regime that the U.S. is in support of is one that breeds Al-Qaeda, as we know over the years. In the remaining minutes, we have like about 5 minutes. We haven't yet talked about the other kind of negotiations going on, which is the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. So any words on those?
As you know, Secretary Kerry has been very active. Presumably, the elements of the deal that they are talking about are nothing to write home about as if you're a Palestinian. But despite the fact that the terms of the agreement seems to be much worse for the Palestinian than, for example, the Clinton parameters were many years ago, I don't know whether it's true or not, but it requires acknowledgement of Israel as a Jewish state and so on.
That's true.
We haven't seen the details of it, and it sort of, effectively cedes the Jordan Valley to the Israelis for many years.
The Israelis wanted that. I mean, that's one of their demands.
Exactly. So despite that, there's tremendous opposition to it inside Israel. Okay?
They want even more.
They want even more. And, it's the reality, And in fact, as, Kerry has been negotiating, the Israelis are planning for more and more settlements and more constructions in East Jerusalem and so on. So it has led to quite a bit of friction, as you all know. Ultimately, Kerry in Munich came out and said, if you don't do this, Israel will be facing more and more sanctions, and it was taken as a great offense. But that is why this issue of international civil society sanctions against occupation have become such an important issue for the Israelis. It didn't used to be. The campaign, the boycott, divestment, and sanction BDS movement that, it began by Palestinians calling it, but it has caught on throughout the United States and essentially calls for sanctioning of products that are produced in the occupied territories and investments that are done or has caught on, not because it has been effective in terms of actually preventing these things, but it has created a real issue for the Israelis, especially for those Israelis who constantly say that our interest is security of Israel, but we don't have we don't like occupation because it has placed them in a position that they have to come out and take a position against occupation, and they haven't done so, many of them. In fact, they have opposed the BDS campaign. So Israel is faced in a very difficult situation because it's becoming very clear that a good chunk of its population, some of it obviously the settlers themselves, really do not want to give up the West Bank. And it's not at all clear how Mr. Kerry can manage it, despite the fact that he seems to have convinced the Palestinians to give up a lot. The Palestinian leadership.
The Palestinian leadership. But there's quite a bit of opposition among the Palestinian people to that. And as I was talking to you before the program, that in Jordan a few days ago, there were huge demonstrations against the Kerry plan because it's like selling the Palestinians down the river yet again, So that's an important issue in terms of negotiations and conflict, etc. But now the Israelis are happy because on the one hand, the Arab countries surrounding them are being destroyed, and at the same time, nobody is paying attention to the question of Palestine, so that the Israelis can put more demands on the Palestinians,
Yes, but
etc.
at the same time,
Yeah.
Israelis are being surrounded by instability
Yeah,
and the rise
but
of
this is a
Al-Qaeda.
consequence of their particular actions.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're flat out of time, and thank you very much for coming over. Maybe we'll do another program on that, because we still have a lot to really talk about. So thank you very much,
Thank
and
you for
aloha,
having
and
me.
see you next month. Mahalo.